You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Ellen Lacorte.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show lined up for you. Before we get into that, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Crystal Pico Watanabe at Pico's House. The Pico's House website now has a new look. She's got a team of 8 people who help provide services to fiction authors. She has a full slate of services that now include beta reading. She's got 4 beta readers now. So if you're looking for beta reading services, she can definitely take on your project. Manuscript critique, developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. Authors can also inquire about putting their books in her Book Lovers Box, which is a monthly digital subscription box with a different theme each month. It's free to authors for a limited time. Be sure to check out Crystal and her whole team at Pico's House. That's PIKKOSHOUSE.com. Thanks, Crystal, for sponsoring the show. While cape and spandex movies are breaking box office records, comic book commentator and influencer Ed Gosney doesn't want us to forget the roots of these marvelous wonders. His blog, Cool Comics in My Collection at edgosney.com, covers the gamut of 4-color entertainment, from contemporary comic books to comics made for kids to bargain bin gold to classics that will transport you back in time. Comic books are a perfect blend of art and story, and Cool Comics captures the essence of what these funny books mean to us in a personal way. And make sure to join the Cool Comics in My Collection Facebook group, where members can interact, show off their prized comics, and have opportunities to win. You guessed it, Cool Comics. Published weekly, Cool Comics in My Collection aims to bring you a smile and reminds us why comic books are fun. Be sure to visit edgosney.com today. Speaking of superheroes and comics, my friend Patricia Gillum has a fantastic series called The Heroes of Corvus. It begins with Book 1, a flight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the deaths of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city aren't out of danger. This is such a phenomenal story. She has released up to part 4 now, and I cannot wait for part 5 to come out. If you're looking for a great adventure read that's on the cutting edge of what is in today's entertainment, The Heroes of Corvus is the series for you by Patricia Gillum. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to go to hankgarner.com to subscribe to the show. We're on just about every platform you can imagine. Now stay tuned for our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I have Ellen Lacorte on the show with me. She has a fantastic new book. It is called The Perfect Fraud, and you guys know how much I love thrillers and suspense thrillers, and this one just ratchets the tension straight to the top and doesn't let you go until the end. Ellen, I've enjoyed the book so much, and thank you for joining me on the show today.
My pleasure, Hank.
Ellen, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I think that I've always been a reader since an early age and just avidly read everything. But as I got to be at least a young adult, probably mid-adult reader, I really got a sense of what a gift it was to read a good book. And I thought, if I could do that, if I could leave that and somebody would read my book and be so taken away the way I've been with some of the great books, that would be one of the, besides having children for me, one of the best things I could leave the world. So that was probably when I realized that that's what I wanted to do. But earlier than that, or around the same time, we used to take road trips with good friends of ours who had children about our ages, and they'd get bored on the trips. And so I would start telling them stories, and every story sort of had a mystery clue that they couldn't go through a door, for example, if they had to answer a clue. Often it was a math problem. And I began to realize that I had some stories in me from that.
Was there ever an adult who recognized that you had this storytelling thing and offered encouragement along the way?
I would say probably. I always hate to tell this story, Hank, because when people ask me about, well, when did you decide to be a writer? I didn't have that, I'm going to be a writer since, I was the age of 6. My career is in human resources and has been for the last 30 years up until about 7 years ago. And I was developing my expertise in that field. So I have a master's in literature, but my doctorate is in higher and adult education. And everything I was doing was pretty much directed toward that career, because I have a family, and it was my business. So that's what I was doing. And it wasn't until this is sort of a longer answer to what you just asked, but the last, 10 years of my career, I got very involved in extracurricular activities such as in the arts, such as painting, singing and dancing lessons. I took ballet. I'm taking ballet. I acted in a lot of commercial acting and also in community theater. So it was then when I started to realize that that's really what really fulfilled me. And my husband and I talked about it for 3 years and finally made the move. And once I made the move and was at least starting to work part-time, I think my brain space opened up. And that's when I started writing. So in answer to your real question, then when I started writing, I eventually joined the Philadelphia's Writers Group, which is a wonderful, long-standing group in Philadelphia. And that was when I finally got brave enough to show my stuff to other people and started to get some feedback. I had some submitting of materials to agents before that, and I also had gotten feedback, and I started to think that, hey, maybe this is possible to do, although everybody says it is impossible. So started to get some positive feedback at that point.
Okay, that was a way better answer than I was hoping for. So there's
it was a way longer question than you hoped for.
Well, that's why I ask questions like that. I like long answers. I like you to, I like to get down to the heart of the matter.
Good.
So where do I start? First off, you worked in human resources, and that was the career path that you chose.
Yes.
I love to look at the intersection of things and how these seemingly disparate things tend to work together and to inform each other in these weird ways that we never could expect. But, in hindsight, looking back, you would think working in human resources would be a perfect place for a writer to start collecting stories, and maybe not stories per se, but mannerisms and to watch the behavior of people. Do you look back now and see that there were experiences you had, people you met that have been fodder, maybe not specifically, but, just helps the writer's brain?
Yeah, always. There is no better career than human resources to gain that kind of insight. But I've always sort of been that person who listens intently, listens for what's not really being said. I've been known to ride elevators an extra couple floors because I get invested in the story people are telling each other in the elevator. I know,
right.
It's a little stalky, but yeah, it was a wonderful career on so many levels, not the least of which is that it really helped me to look into what people do and why they do it. Because it's amazing what people will do to not work. So you really have to have you have to genuinely like people, but you have to want to understand them too, because we've got so many levels going on, and I think that does help you when you're a writer. It's more than just the superficial outside picture we're seeing.
Right. The other thing, do you know how rare it is for someone that is an adult, that has an established life to start pursuing artistic expressions, outside their normal life? I think if you asked, a handful of people if they would, if given the chance, would they like to pursue some sort of art, whether it's dance or painting or community theater. And I think everybody would say, yes, I would like to do that. And nobody does it. And there's something about getting stuck in a rut, and what was that motivation for you to start looking for ways to express yourself?
Yeah, it is a pretty insane thing to do. I will admit.
Gloriously insane, though.
I will admit to that too. It was. I began to understand that you can be very good at something, but still not want to do it for the rest of your life. And I was so grateful for the positions I had most recently with Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where I was Assistant Vice President for Human Resources. And in all my positions, I had fantastic colleagues, great salary, great benefits. But I would get this knot in my heart when I thought about sort of marching my way trudgingly toward retirement. It just didn't sit right with me. And I know that's the common path. Everybody thinks, well, once I retire, I'll do this. And I haven't really lived that way. And I didn't want to have that path for myself. So there's a lot to be said for, as I said, I'm sure there were other things I could have done in human resources, most definitely, but a lot of it's cyclical. So you do the same things. The people change, but you have the same kinds of guidelines and administration that you follow sort of year after year. And writing is so completely different from that. It's all coming from inside you. You are crafting that. And I just felt this insane need to start over, to be stupid again, to do something that I didn't know how to do, and I really didn't know how to do it. The writing, I think, is one of those things where it does come to you or it doesn't come to you. I think you can improve it through craft, but I really think inherently you have to have, like any art, you have to have the skills. But as far as the publishing, marketing, getting an agent, getting a I had not a clue. So I wanted to learn that, and I had to fail several times. I had to get up and see what I did wrong and try it again. And there was something very invigorating about that. And I've never looked back and regretted it.
Now, you also had a tiny bit of a jump start on writing. You actually have a degree in English, don't you?
I do. And my master's in literature. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a pretty good foundation.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't necessarily translate to writing fiction, obviously. But it's a set of tools.
I believe so. I'm always amazed when I talk to people, and I've given lectures to writers group, and I'll say, well, how many of you are reading something right now? And there are some people who aren't reading anything. And I truly believe that you cannot write unless you read voraciously. And so you've got to be reading. So in the master's in literature, I got to read some wonderful literature that probably you wouldn't do otherwise. And I had to always write. But writing in business is so different from writing fiction. And I will tell you that, my first tries at novels were kind of clinical and sort of clean cut the way an email would be. I had to reteach myself to write what was really in my head and not keep editing it out for other people. I had to really just, let those the creativity flow a little bit.
Well, like writing for business and then writing fiction for yourself it kind of uses the same toolkit, but it's kind of like the difference in working on a car and a jet airplane. You may, get the same wrenches and things like that, but
right.
The application is pretty different.
That's exactly true. That's a really good analogy. And then crafting an entire book, and making that flow together and getting the peaks and valleys and making sure the action stays, moving forward. it's a challenge. And I don't think that you can be up to that challenge unless you read enough to sort of get a sense of the arc of a good story. So I learned a lot from other writers. I learned a lot from books that I didn't care for. So just keep reading.
Let's jump forward just a little bit, or maybe backwards from where we were. Tell me about your time in Arizona, and how did the part of Arizona that you lived in, I believe, has this sort of reputation for a lot of mystical type people and things like that happening. Did that have an effect on you in did that affect your imagination in any way?
Well, my husband and I moved to Arizona shortly after we were married, and we lived in the Valley, which was the Mesa, Tempe, Chandler area, and had really intended to be there for just a couple of years. And then 25 years later, with children and really good friends and jobs, we were still there. But then the East Coast kind of called us back, and so we returned, and we've been here for 20 years. But while we lived in the Valley, it seemed like every August, when the temperature was about 115, our air conditioner would conk out, and we would escape. And when in the Valley, you escape north to either Sedona or Flagstaff or Prescott, and we would go to Sedona. So Sedona, I think, is the area you're talking about, which is a sort of a hub for psychics and mystics and vibes and vortexes. And but the original origin of sort of the fascination that informed main character in this book started way before that. My husband, Mike, is a very down-to-earth, level kind of guy. His profession is he's a CPA, and he's a financial analyst and a business advisor, so very level-headed. But he had these other interests. This was in college, and they were Ouija boards and aliens and psychics. And so he kind of got me interested in psychics, and over the years we would visit different psychics. And the one about 7 years ago, we went to a little town in Pennsylvania, and we both saw separate psychics at that time and met on a bench afterwards. And I said, well, how was it? And he said, oh, it's great. She said, you know, our kids are good and business is fine and our family is healthy. How was yours? At which point I started to sob, because my psychic experience at that time was she kind of gave me a mediocre reading. Sometimes they're on the mark and sometimes they tell you the same things they told the 4 people before you. But at the end, she said, well, I can tell according to your cards and to your reading that you're not giving enough to your marriage. She said, but don't worry. For $450, I can be your soul sister, and I can help you with that, and you can contribute more to your marriage and actually get on a higher spiritual plane. So, fortunately, I backed out of there and, you know, walked over to Mike, and after he assured me I was giving enough to the marriage, I thought, what better way to get to a woman's heart than to tell her she's not giving enough, and what better way to her pocketbook? And that kind of was a basis for Claire Hathaway, one of the main protagonists in the book, who believes that, although she had training as a psychic, she fully believes that she's lost those skills, and basically she's faking her way through readings in Sedona now.
I was immediately intrigued by this book because where my family and I don't live in this house anymore, but we lived for about 15 years about a mile away from this lady who was a palm reader, and she just had this house, and she had a sign in her front yard, and it was Miss Mary's palm reading, and and it was so weird because you would drive by during the day, and it just looked completely dead. There was nobody around, just nothing going on. But when the sun went down, you would see cars pull in, and it was this running joke, that, nobody wants to be caught there, when they can be seen in the day. And it was so funny. But and I don't know anyone that admits to actually meeting her. I've never saw her or anything like that.
Right.
But, it's just kind of this running joke of the town psychic, that's just doing exactly what you said, just pulling the wool over people's eyes. And I had the idea one day for a short story that I wrote and published, and it was It was called The Witching Hour, and it was about a psychic who was completely faking it, and she had named herself Rhiannon, after the Fleetwood Mac song, but because it was kind of mystical. And then one day a client comes in who is the real thing and kind of challenges her, and I just thought that was provocative, the idea of a faker, but that there actually was something real out there. And the faker being called on the carpet, the cynical faker. As you started kind of peeling back the layers of what the story was going to be, how did it begin to take shape for you?
It's The Perfect Fraud, which is the book, and I had the idea for Claire, for Rena, who's the other character, who's a mom with a very ill daughter who Stephanie, her daughter's now 4, but she's been sick since she was born. And Rena, her mother, is beside herself trying to find some kind of an answer for what's going on. And she blogs all the time, and other people throughout the nation and the world give her assurances or give her advice, but she's still left with this daughter who's in constant pain. So she decides that she's going to find the best pediatric gastroenterologist in the nation, and that person happens to be in Arizona. So what happens is that due to a seat change on an airplane, and I happen to believe that things happen for a reason, so take what you may, whether they were meant to be. But Claire, the psychic, and Rena and her child end up sitting next to each other. Rena gets very excited about Claire being a psychic and a medical intuitive, and that's when their lives collide, and they have to really face truths about themselves. But Stephanie's life hangs in the balance. So besides the adventure that I had with that psychic, I've also been a ripper-outer. And I guess when you asked me that first question early on, I was kind of thinking about this. When do you know that you have stories to tell? Even while I was working in HR, I would hear stories, or the Chronicle of Higher Education is kind of the Bible for weekly periodical for HR and academic people. And I'd find articles that interested me, and I would rip them out. And I have a folder full of things that just said, well, this is kind of intriguing. And when I started to think about how these two characters to come together and what their stories should be, I reached back into that folder and just found something that interested me, which I can't really share because, as you know, there's a lot of twists and turns with this book.
Do you still look for little story ideas like that, or things that might tickle the writer's brain?
Always. If I'll hear something and I'll kind of write it down, and normally it's so cryptic that I can't really read my writing afterwards, but I do a lot of that just listening to people and the stories that they tell, and just cutting out things, radio thing, anything that I pick up that I think, wow, what an interesting story. Because it doesn't have to be the main part of your story. It could be a subplot. It could be a character that you wanted to bring in but wanted to make them a little more fully formed. It's everywhere. I can't avoid it.
Another big theme of the book is motherhood. And sisterhood in a way, if you kind of compare, or the relationship between Claire and Rena that happens, there's an interesting dynamic between the two of them, as well. But what was the motivation, the idea to explore these close relationships and the complications that come with being a mother and being a daughter, and looking for freedom for yourself while being holding on to what makes you who you are. There's some really complicated and interesting things that you explore.
Thank you. I think it's so inherent in who we are with our parents, and sometimes particularly with mothers and daughters for certain, that what we pick up, what we push off, what's given to us that we don't really want, either genetically or by environment. And I've always been fascinated by that. And each character, Rena and Claire, have to, in some ways, either reconcile or defend themselves against how they were mothered. In Claire's point of view, in Claire's story, her father was very ill as she was growing up, and her mother had to make a living, and her mother was emotionally fragile and really left a lot of what had to do with caring for her husband to her daughter, who was very young and had to take responsibility on it at such a very young age that she becomes sort of overwhelmed with responsibility. And at the time we meet her, she just can't bear to take on any more responsibility, including any commitments that might require responsibility, such as to her boyfriend Cal, who's very patient and loving and would love nothing more to spend his life with her, and she just finds herself pushing him away. So I think we all find ourselves in our current lives needing to make some decisions or some actions that have these threads that wind back to our childhood, and that certainly affects Claire. Rena in a completely different way. Her mother is very tough on her. Her mother and father both favored her sister, and Rena didn't get a lot of attention growing up, and that informs her actions as well.
You talk about the fact that things happen for a reason, and this chance encounter on the airplane between Rena and Claire, and their lives intersect. When you start thinking about that and you're writing the story, how do you start imagining the fallout that as people intersect, like how does the plot and the intertwining of these characters start coming together?
Well, that's always interesting to me, too, and I should have a better answer than this because I wrote it. When I write, I have the end in mind. I know where I'm going, and I know there are writers in my writer group, for example, who don't, and to me, that's like taking a hike that's very complicated without some kind of a map. But that's sort of where my map ends. I know that my goal is to move each chapter forward, and I usually, and this sounds a little bit bizarre, but the characters tell me how they want to do that. So I'll give them an action, and then I will look back and say, well, okay, Claire, how are you going to respond to this? And all right, Rena, what do you think? And knowing their personalities, because they sort of come to me fully formed, they'll sort of figure their way into their next set of holes that they fall into or mountains that they might climb. But I really allow the characters to drive me. I've been saying I do a lot of my best writing in the shower, that I hardly ever sit down and have writer's block, which is, I'm not bragging, I just don't write until I have something to say. And usually I'll craft what that next chapter is going to be. And when you have alternating narrators, then you're focused on, okay, where was Claire before? And what happened to her in her chapter maybe with Rena? And the book starts out where the two don't intersect at all until I don't know what chapter it is. But then they have that meeting on the plane. And then the trick is to see how their lives are parallel, see how their lives are intertwining, what that means for each of them, what that means for the other characters in the book. And that's where it gets to be, kind of thrilling for me as a writer and hopefully thrilling for the audience too.
Well, and we couldn't have a suspense book, a thriller book, unless something went horribly wrong. What do you do to your characters, and what is introduced that makes us question? I'm trying to think of how to frame this question to kind of let you take it where you want. That makes us question the presence of evil and what that really means in our world.
Right. Evil is a very interesting writing tool. Evil comes in so many formats, and I just don't want to give too much of the story away, but we have to kind of determine what motivations there are for the evil that these characters may do. And is it pre-thought? Is it genetic? Or hereditary, or is there insanity? With both these characters, the book, the title is purposeful. It's The Perfect Fraud. And the readers, I think, will be challenged to discover who is the fraud here. Are they both frauds? And what does that mean for the story and for this child? So you have to be very careful when you draw a character who may have some evilness in her or him, because that can tend to be cliche and not. There are very rare people in the world who are truly evil. I don't think there's probably. I guess there are probably really evil person whose predominant strength is evil. But most of us have a little evil in us and a whole lot of redemption. But the reason that characters become interesting, I think, to readers is that that you can identify with them. And if you draw something that's purely evil and dark, you'll have sort of a prurient interest in it, but you may not stick with the character, because both of these characters have really serious problems that they have to overcome. And hopefully the reader will empathize and want to stay with them even as they do some things that are truly out of line with what you would hope they would do.
Right. Well, and if you have a character that is pure evil, it's hard to have a moment of redemption. And not that this book is, has one of those turns at the end where everyone, just becomes, beautiful in the end. I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but we do love to see the humanity show through at some point. And if someone is just Disney character evil, it's hard to do that. And keeping the gray alive throughout is very powerful.
I think that's helpful. I think it's also helpful to when you talk about Disney characters, and I watch a lot of Disney films because I love them, but I also have grandchildren, and usually they get their comeuppance. They're the witch who gets the water poured on them, or they end up going up in a puff of smoke. Unfortunately, we can't wave our magic wands in life and make that happen. So sometimes evil in some aspect may prevail. So it's important to realize that not every story has the bluebirds flying off into the sunset.
Right. What about the supernatural in this book? There is a supernatural element to the book, but not in the way that maybe a Stephen King book is. It's subtle, and you use it deftly to keep us off balance. Let me put it that way. How did you start weaving that in, and did you ever worry about overplaying that hand or not playing it enough? Like, how do you balance putting in things that are unsettling and that we can't explain?
It's. I think the psychic element is, as I said, is interesting to me. And people have asked, well, do you believe in psychics? And my answer is, I've seen enough to convince me that I can't not believe. There's so many negatives in there. Try to figure that one out. But I had an experience once with I'd given Mike a birthday present, and to go see this kind of very well-known medium who's in our tri-state area. And so we went together, and she spent about 30 seconds with Mike and telling him his father says hi. And then she just laser beamed onto me, and she said, your mother's coming through. And she said, you have a medical issue you have to take care of. And just kept saying, you have to take care of this. There's going to be a lot of doctor's appointment. You have to take care of this. And as it turned out, I did have a medical issue. We hadn't seen the doctor yet, but had an appointment with the doctor for the next week. So the medium is just over and over saying, your mother is just saying, you can't let this go. You really have to stay on top of it. So I said to her, the medium, I said, ask my mom if things are going to be okay. And the medium listened for a while, and she said, well, she stopped talking to me. And I said, well, that's my mom. So my mother cut the medium off. But then the medium said, who is Dominic? And my husband's from an Italian family, so we were thinking like there must be a Dominic in there somewhere. We couldn't come up with it. And then on the ride home, we thought, oh my goodness, it's Domchek, who was the doctor I was going to see the next week. And the medium had said, everybody here, meaning my aunt and my uncle and my grandparents, all like her, and she's going to be, she's going to be good for you. And it turns out she has been wonderful for me. So it's things like that where how could she possibly have known that? I didn't tell her I was having a medical issue. I didn't tell her my doctor's name. So those kind of things, if I had been writing and not if I was completely jaundiced about the idea of psychics, it would definitely come through in the book, and it would have been a different story. But there was enough there to allow me to believe that there are people that do have some skills in this area. There are a lot that are just very, very clever. Now, how it sits with a reader is more on the reader than on me. And I've talked to people who said, I don't believe in psychics, but I really like this book, so, because the story can resonate them with other ways. And there are some people who just won't read it, I'm sure, because the psychic or the mysticals are sort of abhorrent to them. But I've always been fascinated by them. Some of my favorite books that probably sort of led me down this. I'm a Stephen King reader, but I've also read like Water for Chocolate, Dogs of Babel, The Time Traveler's Wife, things that have just some otherworldly pieces to them that I just think there are a lot of levels to this world and this life that that are there that maybe we don't recognize because we're looking down a lot. We're watching where our feet are going, and sometimes just looking up a little bit and looking around and opening your mind will give you a whole different perspective.
Well, one way that I like to look at it is that whether I've experienced anything, seen anything, or whatever is kind of beside the point. But the idea that we don't counterfeit things that don't have some value to it. So if someone is counterfeiting money, they don't counterfeit $1 bills because there's no value to it, or they don't counterfeit $3 bills because there's no such thing. So, if you see counterfeit, if you see fakes, then, I like to think that there's maybe something real, behind that they're copying, because you don't copy something that there's no inherent value in.
That's an excellent point. Yeah.
So it's just if that helps to unlock your writer's brain to go places that you just can't with your logical brain, maybe that helps somebody. But when so this was your first novel. How did you? Having not done this before and getting, when I finished reading this book, it is so expertly done and so,
thank you.
I mean, just woven together in a way, that, like you said earlier in our talk, that reading, is such a gift. It can transport you to places and, you have relationships with these people. And it's, this kind of otherworldly thing. Did you have an idea that this book was going to be so impactful from the beginning? And how long did you spend in editing this book?
Well, just to back up just a little bit, this is my debut novel. I wrote 2 other books. The first book was my maiden voyage, and I sent it out to different agents, and I actually got a call from an agent, and I thought to myself, well, this isn't so hard. I mean, she was a reputable agent in New York, but she said, you're a writer, I'm glad you switched careers, but don't go out with this book. And I said, well, how about if I do this? No, don't go out with this book. So I think it was like the first pancake, it's not cooked quite right. So I wrote a second book, and the second book is sort of a precursor to this book, and it did get an agent, but it didn't sell, which is sort of a dirty little secret that you don't realize, that just you can't do the happy dance when you get an agent. And then I learned so much from those 2 and that experience. I wrote this book, and I could tell right away it was a whole different animal. The editing is always a challenge, especially when you're editing on your own. So I have, in this writer group, I had a group of 5 people who were my beta readers, and I used them to not only drive me to complete the book. So I would challenge myself to write 3 or 4 chapters and send that out. And as they were editing, giving me back comments, I was writing the next 3 or 4 chapters. So it was like a homework assignment. So I think it helps when you have somebody depending upon you. And then their feedback was amazing. They caught things with continuity. Why is she in this room when you said she was in that room? In addition to grammar, and one of them happened to have a medical background, which was very helpful for this story. Once I was done editing, I forwarded it out to agents, and having a business background, I had a spreadsheet of agents I wanted to send it to. And at a last minute, I decided to a few of the agents who had read the prior book and liked it but didn't want to represent it. And one was the magnificent Molly Friedrich in New York. And she read it. She actually called me up and yelled at me for 20 minutes. She said, "Why didn't you send this to me first? I'm going to Europe for my daughter's wedding, and I don't want to spend time if you have 90 other people interested in it." And she yelled at me for like 20 minutes, and she finally said, "Let me tell you what we're going to do." I said, "That would be good," because I thought she was going to yell at me and hang up, which I couldn't see the merit in that. But she said, "I don't want you to make a commitment until Memorial Day." So this was a year ago, May. And I'd had 2 other agent offers, but I agreed to kind of hold on that and could talk because she wasn't sure she was going to like the manuscript. And she called me from Italy the day after her daughter's wedding. It turns out that Lucy, her daughter, had read it before she finished her vows, and Molly had loved it and finished it the next day, and they were very interested in signing me. And then so I hooked up with them, and we had some edits to do there, not too many, fortunately. And then in late June, she went out to market, and then said that the editor at Harper, Sarah Nelson, who's also wonderful, wanted to talk to me. So you probably know how these things go, Hank. They want to talk to you for a couple reasons. They want to know that you're not a nutcase, but they also want to know how amenable you are to making changes, because there are big and maybe some small edits, and there are authors who just stand tough in their boots and say, "I know it's 120,000 words, but I'm not changing one of them," even though you would never sell a debut novel at that big. Right. So she had some wonderful ideas, and some ideas that didn't immediately click, but I said, let me think about them, and came back with an alternate idea. And we didn't have a whole lot of major edits to do, and so Molly, I think, sold it in July, and Harper wanted a summer read for this summer, and it's just about as fast as you can get a book out. And it was good for me because I don't like lag time, so I was willing to just keep working at it. And then once you switch off of working on the book, you're working on marketing, and that's sort of what has kept me busy. But
well, Ellen, I absolutely love the book. It is, I couldn't have picked a better book and a better conversation to be episode 666, and we had a good laugh about that before. Yeah. But yeah, I'm recommending it to everybody. It's such a fantastic book. First off, are you working on anything next?
It's funny because Harper's just been talking to me. They would definitely like something that also includes a psychic in the next book. Originally thought that we would circle around the Claire character and keep her story going, but I'm not feeling the serialization of that character. I love her, and there's more to be done with her, but she may show up in another book, but it's not going to be her story. But for a long time, I didn't have a cell in my head that wasn't dedicated either to writing. I've written several articles and that came out with the pub date, and marketing. But just recently, as my space in my brain has opened up a little bit, I have had the next idea for the next book, which I hope to. I'm really eager to get down to it, but probably won't be to the fall. I've got lots more touring to do, and so it's going to take a little while.
Well, I love it. If people are just discovering you, is there a place online where they can, read more about you and follow along with news coming up?
Absolutely. I would like to ask, too, if people read this book, it's The Perfect Fraud, that they would leave a review on Amazon. I would always appreciate it. Every review helps. My website is ellenlacorte.com. It's very simple, and there's lots more on there and lots more to come. So if you sign up to keep in contact with me, you can also register for a free psychic medium reading that we're giving away as a drawing in the fall, and it could be in Arizona if you happen to be in Arizona, but also by phone. So we're getting somebody good.
Great. The Perfect Fraud is available everywhere now, in hardcover and audiobook and Kindle ebook edition. There's links to it in the show notes to the show here, to the Amazon page and to your website. Ellen, I love what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
My pleasure, Hank. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful interview.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Author Stories. Go to hankgarner.com to find all of the archives of the show, and be sure to subscribe while you're there. Now stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
The ancient building wore the severe cassock colors of a Puritan minister, a uniform monochrome of slate-gray shingles and soot-gray clapboards, its shadowed upper windows cross-hatched like the facets of a spider's eye. The second story protruded beyond the first and bore the house's only ornament, 2 gray teardrops of wood, weeping from each corner of the building's stiff upper lip. The place would have looked sinister and foreboding in its shadowed alley if not for the die-cut silhouette of a dancing sheep, jaunty above the door, and the 2 front bay windows that blazed with colorful, welcoming light. The windows were hung with orbs of colored glass on staggered lengths of ribbon. Each orb glowed with autumnal reds and delicate greens, burgundy tints and pumpkin hues, dappled raspberry and clover lime, streaked with light and weightless as bubbles over a cauldron. The shelves below offered crystal skulls and silver daggers and horny devils, Celtic chalices and woven dream catchers in dreamcoat hues. A primitive broom leaned in a corner, ready for flight, and a rhapsodic nude in bronze clutched her goat-legged lover beneath a jackal bust of Anubis. The interior of the shop was even witchier. Above a crude and sooty fireplace, a stack of brick barely holding the shape of a chimney pushed through the barn-high roof, threading ancient beams that crisscrossed overhead. Brooms and kettles and Christmas lights dangled from these, alongside Halloween costumes and Chinese umbrellas, pointy hats and bundles of herbs. Jason wandered deeper into the shop. His fingers trailed across strange bronze statuary and Aztec masks of turquoise and lapis lazuli. He rolled his eyes at the luck candles and money charms, but goggled indecently at a nude and anatomically correct silver nymph with long golden hair that reminded him of Kate. "See anything you like?" Jason jumped, turned, and jumped again. The woman standing before him was the living embodiment of every hippy-dippy counterculture type he'd ever seen. Her hair was green, her face pale and round, her doughy body wrapped in some elaborately woven ethnic garb. Her eyebrows were black and pierced in little rows, and her eyes were heavily circled with midnight blue, as if she'd been sucker-punched by an oil slick. She tapped the glass over the nymph. "Admiring the goddess, I see." She'd practically caught him with porn. "You want to hold her? She won't break. Here." The woman flipped open a glass door and handed Jason the naked figure. "See how heavy she is? You could bang her against the wall all day and barely make a dent." She waggled her eyebrows, obviously enjoying his discomfort. He checked the price tag. $700? "The goddess is a symbol of love and fertility. Don't be ashamed of desiring her." The woman's long green fingernails plucked a long black cigarette from a long red case, and she lit it. "I sense," she blew smoke and studied its whorls, "dissatisfaction in love. Yes, I have just the thing." She pulled Jason into a side room where the smell of her clove smoke gave way to the skunky aromas of potpourri sachets, tea leaves, and hanging clutches of twiggy flowers. She searched, found a little bundle, and pressed it into his hand. "This will make you irresistible. Rub it on your nethers twice a day, and love shall surely find you." Jason made a face. The bundle smelled like cow manure. He didn't even want that on his hands.